Hello and welcome to CRF's podcast, Deep Focus. I'm Neha Khanna. In this episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the union budget that was presented a few days ago. To decode it for us and to help us understand what it means for the Indian economy, we're joined today by two very special guests. We have with us Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Mr. V. Anantha Nageswaran. So thank you so much for joining us. And we also have with us another very special guest, Chintan Research Foundation President Shishir Priyadarshi. Thank you, sir, for being with us. All right. So let me begin with you. Um, Before we talk about the budget, please indulge me for a moment because we need to talk about another huge development that has taken place this week. The much anticipated and long awaited India US trade deal has finally been announced. Even as we wait for the details in the fine print to emerge, we do know that tariffs are going to be slashed from 50% to 18%, which means the 25% punitive tariffs now go. President Trump has also said that India is going to stop buying Russian oil altogether and will impose zero tariffs on US goods. In your view, how significant a deal is this, coming as it does close on the heels of the India European Union free trade agreement? And are there any details of this deal that you can share with us?
No, unfortunately, the details are not yet out in the public domain, so I am not privy to them at this point. Beyond everything else that others have also seen, the two posts by the respective leaders of both the countries. But we should wait for the fine print to emerge in the coming days. But that said, I think it's a very important one because simply looking at the private consumption share of GDP in the US, it's 70%, and the economy is about $28 trillion size. The consumption share, therefore, is 21 trillion. So even if you add the overall GDP size of the other regions or countries with whom we have concluded free trade agreements, they don't add up to 21 trillion. That's one part. So you need to have access to that market. It's important. The second dimension is not so much the exports alone, but it's also the impact it has had on capital flows because investors, portfolio investors or foreign direct investors were beginning to ask questions. Portfolio investors were wondering, India doesn't have an AI play in the stock market. Valuations are high. And if the United States and United States was looking at both goods as well as services sector, H-1B visa, a lot of noise around many things, both goods and services. So they were trying to assess where was India's growth going to come from in corporate earnings, etc. If all these things were now up for grabs. The direct investors, on the other hand, were looking at does this make China plus one strategy where India had an important role to play? Does this 50% tariff make China plus one completely irrelevant? So these were various questions that were in their minds, and they held back their capital flows to India. And you saw the outcome was the rupee depreciation. Because you are a current account deficit country, you need external capital, whether we like it or not, no matter how manageable the current account deficit per se, which it is in terms of absolute numbers, but you need to finance it. And when that financing becomes harder to come by, the currency takes a hit. So I think the significance of this agreement, therefore, is not just with respect to the exports, but also with respect to what it does to many other strategic considerations that we have, becoming a global manufacturing power, being the China plus one alternative in the world, and therefore what it means for the Indian rupee. Because while we can say that the currency doesn't really matter in the current scheme of things because the fundamentals are very good and import costs are not going to be very high because the rupee is depreciating, etc. All that is true. But nonetheless, it does make people uneasy if the currency depreciates every day. So all these things were tied somehow to the resolution of this matter. And therefore, that it is resolved is a very good augury for the next financial year for India.
Most certainly. Mr. Priyadarshi, this is good news for the Indian economy, and this is certainly good news for India US ties that were under enormous strain in the recent past. What's your assessment of the India US deal? Now, 18% tariffs are amongst the lowest in the world. Um, it's a huge relief because it comes down from 50%, though it also involves zero Indian tariffs on US goods. There is no clarity yet from the government of India on whether it's indeed agreed to stop buying Russian oil, a claim that President Trump has made. We don't know what the deal says about agriculture and dairy, which are two sensitive sectors for India, even though Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal has said today that the agriculture sector and India's sensitivities around it are fully safeguarded. That's all we know so far. Also, President Trump's claim that India has agreed to buy $500 billion worth of American products is a bit hard for some people to digest. How do you view whatever we know so far of the deal?
Thanks, Neha. Look, you mentioned the impact on India-US relations. You mentioned the impact overall on India's economy. But I'll add a third dimension too. The impact of this on overall the multilateral trading system. Yeah. Let's start with that in the reverse order. Look, the WTO has been under immense strain. It has. The way the United States has perhaps, quite on its side, they justify it on grounds of emergency measures. But the fact is that this whole MFN concept and the whole concept of bound rates has gone for a toss. WTO reforms have stalled. And you suddenly have these two players for different reasons, both the United States and India, perhaps, taking a step back away from the multilateral trading system has not been good news in the last 6 to 8 months. This deal, coming very soon on the heels of the India EU FTA, I think would give a strong impetus for some of the discussions, especially multilateral, but some of the plurilateral too discussions to start getting revived in the WTO. So firstly, it's really good news there. The second, India-US ties, extremely important. Historically, it's taken years to build them up. And therefore, I'm going a little bit from the economic aspects that the chief economic advisor spoke about, a little bit more into the geopolitical aspects. What we do on trade also has a very, very strong impact on the broader India-US relationships. They have been somewhat, been suffering, I must say, and perceptively, sometimes perceptions are as important, perceptively, people have seemed to feel that, yes, we are slipping and sliding. And I think this will certainly kind of push back things. And I've always felt that while economists or trade analysts like the two that you have with, with you on your show, uh, we'll go by hard data and facts, but I think there are two factors you should always see as an impact on anything. The way the currency react and the way the stock markets react. Yeah, and both reactions have been spontaneously positive. So I think to that extent, Neha, this is very important. And I'll end by saying just one thing. We've got the announcement. And yes, you will probably be reading a lot in the press. Our details are not known, whether our sectors are preserved, when does that tariff become 18, etc., etc. But look, leaders at that level announce the deed only when all of it has, or let's say most of it has all been sold out. So we're probably just waiting for a few days. And once we get the leaders to sign off on the specific political declaration, and that is when the tariffs will come in. So all in all, very positive.
Very positive development. Before I go back to Mr. Nageswaran to discuss the budget, I want to ask you a follow up question. It's interesting you referred to multilateralism and you expressed optimism there, but I'm going to play the devil's advocate and ask you this question. India, in recent weeks and months, has signed free trade agreements with multiple countries. Many actually say that as a pivot away from the WTO led global trade policy. Do you see it as that or as only a temporary response to stalled multilateralism?
Neha, you're speaking to, I must say, a dinosaur of WTO. And I kind of joined WTO, grew up there when, the primacy of the multilateral trading system was something we all held that little flag in our hands to talk about. But over the years, you very strongly not only realize, but you start believing in it, that the two can exist absolutely side by side. In fact, when the WTO rules were framed and they actually encompassed the possibility of customs unions and free trade agreements and regional trading agreements, it was in the very strong belief that these would be building blocks for the multilateral trading system, meaning that if you liberalized in a smaller domain and your domestic industry or domestic producers were comfortable with that much lower tariffs in whatever domain you did it, whether as a customs union or with bilateral partners, then over time you would also be comfortable in extending that same concessions on a multilateral basis. Sure, on the other side, people have also said that the plethora of such agreements, instead of being building blocks, become stumbling blocks. But today's perspective, when a bit of WTO decision making has been kind of stalled, and the appellate body is completely waiting to be rejuvenated, I think these continuous FTAs that are being signed globally, including by India, would actually wouldn't be a stumbling blocks, but would actually aid the overall revival of the FTAs.
That's an interesting perspective. The two can coexist. All right, Mr. Nageswaran, let's now talk about the budget. So, looking at the big picture, now every budget claims continuity, some mark a shift. In your assessment, how does this budget stand out? How does it advance the Viksit Bharat mission? And what image of India does it project to the world?
This budget actually is has a very strong but quiet intent with respect to deepening manufacturing, preparing the ecosystem for it through various customs duty exemptions and specific interventions in 6 or 7 key areas where India needs to develop domestic capabilities, whether it is biopharma, chemicals, labor-intensive textiles, etc. And more importantly, also some announcements may appear somewhat uh, s- uh, trivial, but insiders will know that it's significant. For example, reviving the 200 old industrial clusters, because scale comes through clustering in a country which is dominated by small and medium enterprises. So this budget is quite on intent. It continues to reinforce the macroeconomic stability we have enjoyed post COVID, which has been one of India's hallmark in the last 5 years post COVID. Uh, Moves forward the agenda on fiscal prudence with the 4.3% deficit target, and also reducing the debt to GDP ratio by 0.5%. And then, more importantly, if you look at the skilling areas announced in the budget, allied health professionals, care economy ecosystem, orange economy, tourist guides, the common element that links all these four is the fact that they are relatively AI immune, AI resistant. Areas where human touch is needed. And we need to therefore motivate and nudge our youth to focus on these areas as well, because some of the traditional jobs which they are familiar with may become redundant in the AI dominated world. So this budget makes a quiet beginning in those spaces, apart from a lot of people centric development items. And then if you look at what is done in part B on tax matters, they kind of speak to the priorities outlined in part A. The 7 high-speed bullet train corridors or the east-west industrial corridors, they will create a lot of downstream impacts as well. So I would say this budget advances the Viksit Bharat, because reforms in India have been happening in the last 6 to 8 months outside the budget. There is no need to use budget as the only platform to announce reforms, because they have been happening and that will continue to happen. The PM has reiterated its GST, direct taxes, labor code, environmental rules and regulations, opening up of announcement of the RDIF and the ANR of the research funds that Government of India has funded, and more procedural changes happening in the. Some of them might.
Thanks to Trump.
Sorry?
In part, thanks to Trump, perhaps?
I really don't think so, because in Government of India it takes time to build consensus both within the system. Some of them have been set in motion well before. It may appear as if that they followed the announcement of the penal tariff or the reciprocal tariff, but I would consider that largely coincidental. So this budget therefore does what it has to do, which is to maintain the fiscal ship well, and advance the macroeconomic agenda and strengthen the foundations of what it would take to become a manufacturing player, and advances the idea of trust-based governance through many of the provisions announced in Part B on the tax matters. So this budget, I think, moves the agenda for Viksit Bharat, manufacturing, trust-based governance in all these, and also AI compatible skilling, So in that sense, the budget has done a very good job of what you said about focusing on the Viksit Bharat in its own way.
Mhm. It focuses on Viksit Bharat. And also, very interestingly, he refers to manufacturing. So that's what I want to ask you about. And I'm going to bring in the economic survey authored by the gentleman here. The economic survey shows that India's export growth over long periods has been led more by services than by merchandise goods exports. Even agricultural exports between 2020 and 2025 grew at a faster pace. So the question I want to ask you, Mr. Priyadarshi, is this: has manufacturing become the proverbial middle child of India's development story despite repeated interventions? And does this budget adequately address that?
Look, it's very easy to sometimes be somewhat critical of the growth of manufacturing, especially as compared to the rise in our services export. Especially when I talk that coming usually from a layman. Now, look, services exports, especially in a country which has a strong base in IT and business services, is far easier to expand with relatively low infrastructure cost. I mean, you can expand that. But if you look at manufacturing requires land, power, logistics, supply chain, skilled labor force, you name it all. I think the manufacturing being put on a faster growth track has been there for maybe a year or two, certainly even before that. But certainly the last few years we've had a strong focus on it. This budget too. This budget too gives a stronger focus on it. And it is important, I would say, not just from the point of view which you said, which it is, the Viksit Bharat, where we have to have growth of 8 to 9% annually, but also because of the fact you're citing FTAs. And all these FTAs are just market access openings that you're being given. How much they convert to actual trade gains or actual market access gains would very much depend on your manufacturing capacity. So it's in a way like what we traditionally used to say in WTO, that the WTO can at best give you an opening. How far you walk through that open door would depend on your own supply side capacity and trade related infrastructure. In the case of India, how far we walk through that door will depend on our manufacturing capability. Let me just add two small caveats. We keep looking at the government, you know, but industry also, I think, has a very, very important role to play. How much is industry, kind of investing in R&D? What are they doing as far as technology, automation? You know, they have to assume that they have to become the best competitive manufacturers in the world. The government will facilitate. But if the industry keeps saying, "No, no, sir, the government needs to do more, etc., that, I mean, for me, that argument is only about 40%. 60% of the ball, I would definitely put on air on the in the industry court. Also, the government would soon, and I think you can already see that in the budget, as the chief economic advisor said, we have to move away now from incentives to more of facilitation. Incentives, fine. I mean, we had the PLI scheme, which has really got huge investments in. But now we move on to more on reducing not just the ease of doing business, cost of doing business, facilitating it. And I think the budget gives a very strong signal in that direction.
It's interesting you're talking about government versus industry, though I know you're talking more about complementarity, really, than placing them in an adversarial position. But this seems to be an age old debate because industry would turn around and say, do we really have enough of an enabling ecosystem? You refer to ease of doing business. Do we really have enough of that on the ground, or does it largely exist on paper? But, sir, I want to focus now on specific sectors that have been highlighted in the budget. Let's talk about semiconductors, a hugely significant area, and we constantly talk about this competition with China. We have a long way to go before we can catch up. India has a growing presence in semiconductor assembly, testing, and packaging. But large scale chip manufacturing still remains at a very nascent stage. Is India's Semiconductor Mission 2.0 uh, looking to plug these gaps? And how is the government supporting this ambition?
So the first answer to your question is the Semiconductor Mission 2, ISM 2.0, looking to plug this gap? The answer is yes. And of course, we are awaiting details because ISM 1.0 committed 760 billion rupees. At today's exchange rates, you can think of it as between 8 to $10 billion. And that's a fairly large sum for a country of our size with multiple competing needs. Even with respect to either OSAT, which is the outsourced assembly and testing, or packaging, etc., or ATMP as they call it, the thing is, it is a very capital intensive industry, and to make 4 mm or 3 mm chips, each machine costs somewhere between 130 to $150 million, and the finer and finer you get to the chip making, the machines become exponentially costlier, and then the entire fab will cost anywhere between 25 billion to $35 billion. So it is a highly capital intensive industry, and therefore it is necessary to prepare the ecosystem first before you move on to the fabrication part. Everybody, TSMC, or for that matter Samsung or ASML, they didn't get there within such a short period, and we are forced to compress the timelines, but these ecosystems take time to develop. So I think the Semiconductor Mission 2.0 tries to do both these things in parallel. I believe one is to make the investments, crowd in the private sector to do the fabrication part, but also prepare the ecosystem, because assembling, testing, packaging, etc., all are very high tech intensive, and they will spawn their own multiplier effects in different areas. So the Semiconductor Mission 2.0 is about preparing the ecosystem, planting India's flag in the fabrication space as well. But more than that, it's to strengthen the ecosystem, so that one somewhere down the road we will be able to get into finer and finer chip making as well.
It's certainly a priority area.
Though it has to be a priority area, because I think some of these items, whether it is rare earth materials, minerals, magnets, and chip, they are becoming strategic items in the fragmented global space. And there are some areas where we need to have domestic capability. Otherwise, the notion that the world will supply us efficiently, I think that we have to let go for at least for quite some time before we get back those days again. So these things come and go in cycles, and we are in a different cycle now. Yeah.
Mr. Nageswaran, I also want to ask you about cloud service. Now, India has announced one of the world's longest tax holidays for data center. But globally, it's been observed that more than tax holidays, it is factors like power reliability, regulatory certainty, and speed of approvals that truly matter. Now, what does India need to do to convert this incentive that is already offering into hyperscale investments?
I think India actually starts with many advantages. Of course, being the most important demand generating country in the world, given that the size of the population, and also in terms of power, I think some of the misgivings in the media are somewhat overstated, because our discoms are back in profit, and some important initiatives have happened quietly below the radar, so to speak. Compulsory metering, automatic pass through of fuel costs from generators to distributors of power, and then this funding mechanism for distributors, wherein conditional upon reforms they are made available funding. And I think that is why our discoms have turned in a profit in 24-25, which is unthinkable. And then also the T&D losses reduction. We used to speak about 25-30% of power generated is lost in, which is basically power theft and so on. That has come down to below 20% to 16% or so. So quietly, a lot of these reforms are happening, and the power reform bill that is being put in consultation space for public comments, which will eventually happen in the course of 2026. Also, make sure that users pay the charges required to be paid, so that power generation remains economically viable, that there is no cross subsidization of the by the industry of agriculture and household sector. So the power generation ecosystem is very much there. And I think again, if we are serving the global companies by being located in India, it becomes another matter of strategic leverage. The important thing is to make sure that water to me is more important than power. Data centers require lots of water, and therefore, to the extent that these companies can also help recycle some of this and make sure that domestic capacity is augmented in water, that will make a lot of sense. Otherwise, in terms of skilled manpower and the demand side, I think India is quite well placed to allow the data centers to service the world from here. Yeah.
Well, let's certainly hope so. Mr. Priyadarshi, let's talk about the defense sector. Now, when you look at the defense allocations in the budget, does it signal to you a shift away from capacity building towards knowledge and domestic IP creation? And does this budget offer incentives to Indian defense companies to invest in R&D, something that you referred to earlier, instead of relying on manufacturing imported designs?
Yeah, defense is probably, based on what's happened last year, would be one of the most closely scrutinized aspect of our budget. And there'd possibly be three ways that we will look at it. One would be merely to see how much has the allocation gone up from last year. And I think that's been a significant increase. The defense budget now at over about close to 8.5 lakh crores constitutes about 14.5% of the total union budget. And I think at the last budget, it was about 6.85 lakh crores. So we have significantly gone. So that's one broad number that would always looked at. But while on broad numbers, it's also important, I think, through your program to highlight the fact that around 50% of this just goes into salaries and pensions. So it's not as if it's a huge amount of money, which is just, every time people think of defense budget, you think of, armaments. And no, about 50% of our budget goes into salaries and pensions. That's one. The second point which people would look at the second they did this, how much is going into capital outlay? And capital outlay in defense is where really that's where the armor or the shells or the planes or the submarines come in. And that for many people, the 22% increase over last year, I think it's gone up to slightly over 2.20 crores. I think that is an important figure. It was needed simply because of what we've gone through. But here also, there is a slight nuance or a byline that we need to emphasize. Look, one, since a lot of our, armament imports is a dollar-based thing, and if you had of a 4 or 5% dollar change, then part of it is actually not as much an increase as you think it is, because 4 or 5% actually just goes into the currency fluctuation. That's one. Second, even more important than allocation, we've got to have a serious look, and I think the government is doing that, on the way that we procure our defense material. Yeah. For certain, a democracy like ours has got to have checks and balances, certainly. But you also have to have an expedited procurement process. So what our defense forces need today is actually given to them yesterday. That has really got to be a target of speeding up the defense procurement process, because the last figure I read about utilization of this year's capital outlay, we still have a fair amount to use up before the end of the financial year.
And the Air Force Chief has been very vocal about this, especially in the aftermath of Operation Sindoor.
Absolutely right. But again, the third aspect is what you also mentioned. And I think, again, we are headed very well in that direction of a strong indigenized private sector participation in defense production. Now, it's not only what the private sector would do for the Indian Defense Forces itself, but a very important barometer would be how are our defense exports going? Because it's not just us internally that we feel, we've got good now defense manufacturing capability coming up, but the real test comes up as the world also thinks similarly. And the way our exports of defense is increasing, and we've set certain very, very significant targets. I think it's about a 3 lakh crore that we would want to put into the export basket. I think that is significant. And I must mention a small anecdote. I was at one such meeting where there were international experts. There were some of our ISTMA people. And they were asked that we hope what you're selling to the world is a 99.9% accuracy. And it was the confidence with which the Indian defense manufacturing services people said it's not 99.9, it's 100%. And it's the confidence of saying it at the weight. So that also is extremely important. In this context, again, like others, there's not just the budget. The new defense acquisition policy, the DAP, is in the annuals, is being revised after 2020. And I think we are, on one hand, strongly encouraging FDI in defense with 100%, FDI in defense coming in. But at the same time, we've also got to ensure that the private sector, which we'll be kind of facilitating and supporting, is not in a way their inputs and resources that they put in are also projected and protected. So defense overall, I think it's a very, very positive budget signal. You just got to translate it to actual acquisition.
Actual acquisition. I think that is where the real challenge lies. Mr. Nageshwaran, let me quote some figures for the benefit of our viewers. Now, India's poverty rates in 2022-23 were estimated at 5.3% for extreme poverty and 23.9% for lower middle income poverty. As a lower middle income country, how is India addressing the need for inclusivity, given that a quarter of our population still live?
No, I mean, fair enough. Whether it is the that's so. So for a country of this size, even if it is 10%, that in absolute terms, the number will be high, right? I mean, so 140, 150 million people. If it is 10% in extreme poverty, it would or on the fringes of poverty, you could be technically in lower middle income, but one major health hazard or calamity might push you back below the poverty line. That is the reason why Ayushman Bharat, the health insurance scheme, and the Jan Aushadhi scheme were brought in, because you don't want the health incident to push the household back below the poverty line, because the breadwinner may be out of be unable to earn income for as long as 6 months or 1 year, and so the public health insurance scheme Ayushman Health is Bharat is very important one in arresting this slide back into poverty, as well as subsidized medicines. And then in terms of routine poverty, so to speak, Prime Minister's Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana is providing almost close to 800 million people free food grains, etc. And then the more important thing is, ultimately the biggest answer to poverty reduction and inclusivity, as you put it, is employment generation and income growth. So everything else that we do in order to make the economy continue to grow, to be able to generate employment. So we have now the labor codes notified that provides a right and which prescribes the minimum wages. So that's a clear balance between employer and employees. And then we had in the budget in July 24 announced several employment linked incentive schemes apart from production linked incentive schemes. And then the states are pursuing deregulation, which we have covered in the economic survey in chapter 16, part 2. Deregulation, what does it do? It is meant to enable small and medium enterprises to be able to focus their limited management bandwidth on growing the business, running the business, which means they hire people, they get their working capital on time. Look at the budget this year. So much of focus given on making the trade receivables discounting system function and become a key component of making sure that MSMEs are provided working capital on time. So they may not speak to poverty directly, but ultimately, to the extent that they all focus on employment generation, income growth, and economic activity being widened, they definitely are addressing the poverty and the inclusivity damage.
All right. Mr. Priyadarshi, let's talk about another aspect. The Self Help Entrepreneurship Initiative. It seeks to essentially empower women as economic agents rather than passive beneficiaries. But we know that a lot of states rely heavily still on cash transfer schemes for women. We saw that, for instance, in the recent Bihar elections. Um, the question really is, how does the central program um, help states shift their policies towards supporting entrepreneurship? And how can the center and the states work in tandem?
Look, Neha, I read and heard that this SHE entrepreneurship initiative very carefully. One, because in a way, as a foundation, we've been working on women empowerment very strongly. It's a very, very important part of each of our verticals work. We feel climate change, economy, even tariff liberalization must be looked at from a gender lens, from a women lens. But the fact is that you had direct transfers so far more often, and now we are moving on to an actual entrepreneurship. I regard too as a continuum. You did start with giving women the power to spend. You had that money. You wanted to give that confidence. Yes, we can spend, we can budget, we can, and trust me, some of them actually use that money to invest. So it's not as if it was just a consumption expenditure. It was going into a number of things. But the finance minister announcing, the real entrepreneurship, the SHE framework, I think it's a very important step, keeping in mind all the feedback that I think government has based on the existing self-help groups. So far, a large number of those self-help groups in the rural area had been credit related. You gave credit to women self-help groups. You found the money was better utilized. You found that the return of that money was better. You found that defaulters were much less. You found that to be a very good self-help group to sustain. Now, we've done very recently surveys in rural areas in Gujarat and Maharashtra, looking at the problems of women entrepreneurs. You've done the first mile with that. They've got support from some form, some foundation, something or the other. What's the second mile problems? One is the ownership is still not completely that of the work. It's still kind of in the household. The man would take over whatever be the money that is earned, and really the ability to spend is still limited. That's one. The second, which I think is very, very important, market intelligence. What should I produce? Who should I be producing it for? Do I need to change a bit of it? How long do I kind of, struggle with whatever may have been? So I think the minute you have a government program which signals the strong support for women entrepreneurship, you're going to see trickle down effects. You're going to see effects which will ensure that women then are much better integrated, that women then have the ownership, and more importantly, once they're taking the monetary decisions, they also have the final control over the way the money is spent. So I see this as a very important, only I know the budget, only a few lines were given to it. I think those few lines are very, very significant.
We certainly need to see women taking the lead. And I think the route to that has to come through financial empowerment. Um, Mr. Nageshwaran, let me ask you this question. India is often described as a consumption led economy with growing imports and domestic demand. How does that shape India's trade relationships? And how does that compare to China, for us?
So Neha, before I come to your question, I just want to supplement his answer to your earlier question on women entrepreneurship, because the important thing is states, while they do unconditional cash transfers, they're also doing a lot on deregulation and also allowing women participation to increase, because states used to curb a lot of occupations as being risky for women. Didn't make sense, when women are in active combat roles today in the army, in the front line of the battlefield. So states are now removing many of the shackles they had imposed on women's participation in the labor force, including working night shifts, etc. And also the entire deregulation exercise is facilitating that, and deregulation happening in states. And then the PM Swanidhi loans, our predominant beneficiaries are women entrepreneurs. So I just wanted to make these 2 points. Now let me come to your question about imports, consumption, and China, etc. Look, China is not considered a consumption economy. It's considered more of a supply side economy, generating a lot of growth through exports, especially post COVID when the domestic economy is in the doldrums. Nonetheless, their imports have been rising along with their increase in per capita GDP. China imports $3.3 trillion, including services. That's not a small sum of imports. So whether you are a consumption-led economy or a supply-driven economy, as long as your income growth keeps happening, per capita income keeps rising, your imports will rise. And that will be true of India as well. So that is why these trade deals are important. You have to finance these imports. And if you continue to import capital, that has to be repaid one day. Whereas if you are financing it through exports, then you are in good shape. And that is why I think trade agreements that we have been striking in the last few years matter a great deal, because ultimately, if you have to have certain strategic resilience in today's fragmented and dangerous world, you have to earn your foreign exchange rather than borrow your foreign exchange. And that is where trade agreements matter, geographic diversification matters, and it also feeds back into your domestic economy, to the industry sector, to get their act together in terms of quality and also in affordable prices. So in multiple ways, this free trade agreements is not only important to facilitate cheaper imports, which imports will always happen in any case as we grow, but it is to make sure that you are able to finance these imports through exports. And that is where these free trade agreements are extremely significant and important. I think the domestic industry has to get its act together in terms of investing in R&D, innovation and quality. And I'm glad Mr. Priyadarshi mentioned one of his earlier responses to your question. Not everything can be solved by policy alone, and I think countries have become where they are, particularly in East Asia, in the last 1 or 2 generations, because the industry pulled its weight as well. And that is the message that the economic survey also points out in chapter 16.
I'm glad that you're plugging the economic survey there, and I do want to refer to it since, of course, we have the author of the economic survey here with us, and you referred to exports. I want to talk about this. The economic survey underlines that high logistics costs and distorted power pricing structures weigh on India's export competitiveness. In your view, how critical are reforms with regard to logistics to fulfill India's trade ambitions? And what are the structural changes needed to make Indian exporters globally competitive?
No, I mean, logistics costs undoubtedly are important, but important also to know that India's logistics cost as a percentage of the overall, export prices or cost of operations has been coming down. So, in fact, I have some data for you to share on the logistics cost of it. Um, it there is a new study that National Council of Applied Economic Research did for DPIIT. So our logistics cost were 8.8% in FY 23 or 8.8% in FY22. Now it is below 8% in FY24. So it's coming down. I mean, because of connectivity, investment in infrastructure, and the GST also, which makes it possible for one country, one tax, etc. So logistics costs will keep coming down, and they matter a great deal. And also, procedures and processes matter in lowering logistics costs. That is why the customs duty reforms announced in the budget, and what DGFT might be doing as well, the Director General of Foreign Trade. These are the areas by which we lower the logistics cost, not just through building infrastructure. And to the extent that the budget sort of made a down payment in terms of doing a lot of process reforms on the customs duty side, they are very critical to lowering the logistics cost.
All right. Uh, Mr. Priyadarshi, let me once again quote the economic survey. It highlights that while emerging markets and developing economies are expected to grow faster in trade volumes than advanced economies, they're more vulnerable to global trade policy uncertainty. I think we can all agree with that. Question is, how does India stand out from its competitors?
Look, firstly, let me fully agree with what the survey says, that certainly the unpredictability and volatility in global markets, in global trade policy, or even the so-called weaponization of trade and tariffs, or the uncertainty because of that, affects developing countries far. India, certainly it does affect that. It has affected, but I think India has certain advantages. And the largest has been the growth that we've had, or that we've seen in the last many years, or the projected growth that we have, certainly helps. We've got a very strong base. Our economy is rising. We are moving up the trillion ladder. But the second is also, it's very much related to the huge market we have, the domestic market, because that gives us both strength and a leverage to sometimes lower the kind of pressures that countries face. So these two factors combined, while we do get impacted, as you rightly said, and as the survey points out, but to a certain extent, there is a small cushion. But there are three other factors, I think, if you really look at it, over a 4 or 5 year period that India has done well at, often not talked about. One, there's a continuous talk about, the importance of diversification of your export markets. Trust me, India has done that. India has done that, not often talked about as much. Look at the fact, our textiles and apparel and even our gems and jewelry faced a sudden 50% tariff in the US markets. You would have expected your exports to significantly get reduced. India had other markets. India had other markets. And our exporters, again, with a lot of facilitation and knowledge inputs from the government, were quickly able to diversify or send things into other areas. So that's been, and it's not just for this, it's been for our business services. This diversification has been for our pharmaceuticals. And I think this diversification, one holds us in good stead. The other, as I just mentioned, you got a large domestic market. Now, that also gives investors confidence, and that is one thing which also gets in your investments. So, to that extent, again, even though there are uncertain global winds, there's uncertain at times global and economic scenarios, India does kind of fare a little better than other developing countries because we are not only seen as an export destination, we are also seen as a consumption destination and as a destination where investment can lead to cheaper manufacturing. And third, and I'll end with that because it's partially already been said, that actually our logistics have been improving. And it is clearly not just because of what was said, but if you really look at and logistics is often much more than pricing. It's not just a cost and load. It's the digitalization, it's the customs procedures, it's actually the last mile connectivity. And here too, I think the economic survey has done a very, very important thing in pointing out the cross subsidization often between power and rail transport and other things. All this now needs to look like a cogent whole. And logistics and the way our logistics, overall emphasis of the government logistics is improving is also going to make us perhaps less vulnerable to global attacks.
Well, let's certainly hope so. Mr. Nageshwaran, I want to ask you this. The overarching theme of the budget seems to be that the government values macroeconomic stability. The fiscal deficit is lower than effective capital expenditure. The question is, what does India need to do to retain this macroeconomic and fiscal integrity in the long run?
Whatever we have been doing in the last 5-6 years, which is to continue to boost supply side capabilities, remove frictions and bottlenecks for economic activity to happen, continue to invest and deepen trust-based governance, and be conservative and prudent in your assumptions when it comes to fiscal parameters, etc., and strengthen macroeconomic resilience, particularly on the export side. But apart from policy, I think it is the private sector has to also make sure that if we have to indigenize, by the way, in today's world, that will also lend macroeconomic stability. Without that, we will be vulnerable. We have to indigenize, but indigenize without using it as a excuse for not investing in quality or productivity and innovation. So, in terms of our mindsets, uh, uh, because we have to indigenize, we should not go back to the old pre-80s mindset of import substitution, which allowed a carte blanche to the industry to basically produce shoddy goods. We need to make sure that protection A should not be in perpetuity, and B, protection should always be in return for productivity gains and export performance on the part of the industry. So we have to take a leaf out of some of the successful Northeast Asian industrializers and adopt some elements of it. Then we will be able to maintain macroeconomic stability.
All right. I know time is limited, and I promised you I only have a couple of more questions for you before we let you go. I want to ask you a larger question about the economy. Recently, correct me if I'm wrong, Ruchir Sharma wrote that, even though we are the fourth largest economy in the world and the world's fastest growing major economy, that has not been sufficient somehow to enthuse investors enough, both foreign and domestic. Why do you think that is?
First of all, let me correct you. We are not yet the fourth largest economy. In fact, we may become one in the course of 26-27. A lot depends on the rupee exchange rate and yen exchange rate against the dollar. So a lot of things have to fall in place. See, the thing is, we are receiving FDI on a gross basis from investors. It is, in fact, if anything, 25-26, our gross FDI inflows were higher than 24-25. The reason why the net numbers don't look that big is because there has been a lot of repatriation of profits of investments made in ester years or ester decades. That is one part. The second reason is Indians' investment in overseas markets has been growing as well. And that is partly because of the changed global environment. Countries now insist that you have to be located in my place to serve me, and I'm not going to allow exports from different locations. So, and the tariff also accentuated the problem. Hopefully now it is behind us. You have to locate yourself in low tariff countries or directly in the importing country to be able to serve those markets. So Indians outbound FDI, ODI as we call it, overseas direct investment by Indians, also picked up. So the and of course, there are many other issues such as tax certainty, tax predictability, continuity. All these things also mattered on the margin. But at the end of the day, India's gross FDI numbers have been rising as a share of GDP. Net numbers have been problematic in the last 2 years, partly because of changed global circumstances, higher interest rates overseas, and Indians' necessity to produce in their markets rather than exporting it from here. But hopefully, this trade deal will change all of that.
Hopefully the trade deal will change all of that. And it's not just one trade deal. We've actually had a whole slew of them, which should make a significant difference. Last question, gentlemen, before I wrap up this conversation. And I want to put this question to both of you, starting with you, Mr. Priyadarshi. On the day of the budget, the markets were quite spooked and we saw a big crash. How did you look at that market reaction? And also, very quickly, and the chief economic advisor referred to it earlier, the rupee hitting record lows against the dollar. How concerned should we be?
Look, I'm not, I'm genuinely not into the stock market. And, I think even the experts will tell you that the stock market has a mind and rationality completely of its own. Uh, but very often it is far more linked to expectations. And I would actually qualify saying it false or magnified expectations. So you raise your own expectation, you start saying this is going to come in, and that when that doesn't come in, the market goes down. But it very quickly stabilizes when reality and realism come into expectations, as we saw happening soon thereafter. But look, stock markets, obviously, there are a large number of factors, and they're not all global or not all budget related. So I don't think we should play too much. I must say what I did hear very soon, and I really like what Mr. Amitabh Khan said. He says, don't go by these fluctuations. See what the budget is doing for long-term reform, for long-term productivity, and our long-term growth toward Viksit Bharat. I would agree to that.
Mr. Nageswaran, the markets certainly rallied once news of the India-US trade deal came in, but what happened on the day of the budget? The markets were really spooked.
As Mr. Priyadarshi pointed out, it is all in relation to their expectations of something related to capital gains taxes, or they might have been spooked by the short-term transaction tax, which was imposed only on futures and options trades. But if anything, in fact, the cash market should have been happier about it. That more money will now flow into the cash market if the government is discouraging people speculating in short-dated futures and options. So, if in fact one could have taken a different line in the stock market, but nonetheless, single day reactions, we should not lay too much store by them. There is a joke that goes around in the US. The stock market predicted 13 out of the last 12 recessions. So, so I think it's important to, and you are right, on the day of the trade deal, the market rallied big time yesterday. That kind of tells you what they were, which we discussed earlier, what they are looking for from India, which is to remain connected with the world and having access to the market and global capital. So in that sense, I think we can treat the market reaction on February 1st as distant memory.
Distant memory and perhaps an aberration. And quick word on the rupee.
No, I mean, we discussed it at great length, Neha, that the real reason was that the capital flows were becoming scarcer for a country that is capital import dependent. As simple as that. When they become scarcer, the currency has to reflect that. So the currency becomes cheaper. Now, I think with
tariffs now being lowered,
I think that will. I mean, it will be a huge game changer for the currency as well.
Well, we certainly hope so for the sake of the Indian economy. Gentlemen, it's been a fascinating and indeed an in-depth discussion on the budget and what it means for the Indian economy. We may have our challenges, and we most certainly do. But being the world's fastest growing emerging economy, I guess, major economy, I guess we do have our moment in the sun. On that note, thank you so much to both of you for joining me on Deep Focus today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed our conversation on the budget and the Indian economy with Chief Economic Advisor Dr. V. Anantha Nageswaran and CRF President Shishir Priyadarshi. Do like, share, and subscribe to CRF's YouTube channel. And stay tuned for the next episode of Deep Focus.